Hello, this is a quick question that comes from revision 1616, and he says, "Hi, thank you so much for today's prediction video. I was just wondering whether both your videos are for the AQA exam board of Mice and Men and an Inspector Calls. As I've been looking on their website on the mark scheme for last year's paper, and it says that contextual knowledge isn't credited in section A of an Inspector Calls, but it is in Of Mice and Men, which means all the useful information on 1945 and socialism isn't usable. Oh, misery. Or maybe this is considered a theme. So this ambiguity about when to use context does come up very often. So here's my reply. I must answer this question every 2 or 3 days. Well done for looking at the mark scheme. That's a brilliant way to revise. I'll make you a video. So here it is. So yes, context is always relevant no matter what the mark scheme looks for. And I'll show you the mark scheme to show you why this is true. Here's an Inspector Calls question from June 2015. How does Priestley present ideas about inequality in an Inspector Calls? And if we scan through, we can see that the assessment objective is number 1 and number 2, and context is assessment objective 4, and indeed it isn't assessed in this question. And so it would seem correct. You don't want to write about context. So why is Mr. Salles saying do write about context? Well, let's have a look at some of the answers that they suggest might be included. Social class as a measure of inequality, e.g., position of the Burlings in society in relation to Eva Smith. Well, you can't discuss that properly without talking about society pre-war in 1912, and you might usefully talk about society in 1945, which is the society that Priestley is trying to change. In other words, to do that bullet point well, you actually have to include some context, don't you? Then we've got Burling's treatment of Eva Smith as a disposable commodity. Well, here you're talking about the capitalist system. Again, that is the capitalist system that Priestley is complaining about in 1945. So that again is a discussion of socialism, historical context. You can't avoid the context in order to make that point. Glimpses are given about her life, how she is forced to live at the mercy of those with money like the Burlings. Again, this is an exploration of capitalism, which is hugely relevant to the political changes of 1945, or indeed the struggles for the working class to get fair salaries during the interwar years. So you can't escape context here. And it's spelt out with the socialist capitalist ideas in relation to equality in the text, the conflict between business and labour. So although there are no dates attached to this mark scheme, the ideas about context at the time are woven into the answer. Let's look at AO2. Well, Burling is a caricature of the callous heartlessness of a capitalistic businessman. Why is Priestley doing that? Again, that's all about the context. So hopefully I've shown you how context is interwoven into the other assessment objectives. The reason it isn't assessed discreetly here is exam boards are necessarily stupid. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but what they do is they try to compartmentalize different skills. Now, if you put yourself in the place of your English teacher will say, here's a text, I want you to understand this text fully, and in order to understand it, you have to know something about who wrote it, and you have to know something about the time that the person wrote it in, because that's what affects why the person writes what they write, doesn't it? That just makes sense. And to exclude that is impossible. But the actual part of the mark scheme that the examiner is going to use to give you a grade is generic. In other words, it works for any question in section A. And let's look at the top. An insightful exploratory response. Well, if you're exploring in an insightful way, surely you have to know something about the context that the author's writing in. That's what makes it insightful. And when you start exploring, you're comparing one idea against another idea. Again, you'll need the context to do that. How are you going to analyse detail in a close analysis? Well, you have to bring more than one interpretation to it. And to do that, you need, again, to know about the context. Once you've got more than one interpretation, you begin to evaluate. But how can you evaluate the writer's ideas if you're not thinking about the audience of the time? You know, an audience in 1945 will react very differently to an audience now. And that's relevant to your answer, because that's how you evaluate. Are you convincing? Well, yes, because you've got some historical knowledge. Do you have an imaginative interpretation? Well, you might, but it could be complete rubbish if it completely disagrees with the historical knowledge. For example, if you wanted to claim that the inspector is a murderer who is trying to kill off Eva Smith at the end in order to attack the Burlings, that's very difficult to maintain. But every year, at least one or two of my students tries to do that. And you can only really argue that if you're ignoring the historical context. So I hope this shows you that the historical context will always be relevant when you're talking about the ideas in AO1 and AO2. And if we go back to the very beginning of the mark scheme, we'll see why this is so. Assessment Objective 1 responds to text critically. Well, you can't be critical if you're ignoring the historical context. It's really difficult. Explain how language, structure and form contribute to the writer's presentation of ideas, themes and settings. Well, all the themes will be based on the writer's historical point of view at the time that they were writing. And so again, you can't really do this properly without writing about the context. Now, the reason that context isn't named here is that what students tend to do when they're writing about context is they just stick down everything they know about the time, and they completely ignore why the context is relevant. And it's only relevant in order for you to justify your interpretations, to justify what you think the author is up to. So I hope that clarifies things for you. In summary, every time you write about the author's point of view, you have to justify it, not just with the text, but with some aspect of the context that will back your ideas up. I hope that's been helpful. If you'd like any further videos, you know what to do. Don't forget to subscribe.